never told my son what I kept in the safe deposit box at First National on Clement Street. Not because I didn't trust him. I trusted my son more than anyone still living on this earth. I kept it from him because some things need to stay hidden until the right moment comes, and I'd learned, after 63 years of living and one long marriage to a woman smarter than me, that the right moment rarely announces itself in advance. You have to be ready before it arrives. My wife Nora passed on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 years before any of this happened, pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't care about your plans. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and she spent 6 of those weeks not feeling sorry for herself, but making phone calls, signing papers, and sitting at the kitchen table with our family lawyer going through documents I didn't even know existed. She was always like that, quiet about the important things until she'd already handled them. The safe deposit box was her idea. She'd rented it the year our son Owen turned 22, right after he'd started dating someone she didn't have a good feeling about. A girl who'd lasted about 4 months before Owen himself figured out the problem. The box had stayed empty for years after that, just the annual fee coming out of our checking account, until Nora got sick and decided to use it for what she'd always intended it for. "You'll know when it's time," she told me. 3 days before she died, she was sitting up in the hospital bed we'd rented for the living room, the one by the window so she could see the oak tree in the front yard. "Don't open it yourself. Wait until Owen needs to see what's inside." I asked her what was inside. She smiled and said, "Everything he needs to know about who I was before I was his mother." I didn't press her. There were a lot of things I stopped pressing her on in those last weeks. You learn to hold the questions loosely when time is running short. Owen was 28 when his mother died. He took it harder than I expected, and I'd expected it to be hard. He'd been close to Nora in a way that some sons are close to their mothers. Not in a dependent way, but in the way where you can tell that a person has shaped who you are. Without trying to control who you become, he cried at the funeral in a way I hadn't seen him cry since he was a small child. He held it together at the reception after, shaking hands with people he barely knew, accepting casseroles from the neighbors, saying the right things. He was good at the right things. About 6 months after the funeral, he told me he'd met someone. Her name was Claudette. He showed me a photo on his phone, standing in my kitchen, grinning like he hadn't grinned in months. She was attractive, I'll say that. Dark hair, wide smile, the kind of woman who looks like she's always slightly amused by something. "We met at Marcus's birthday thing," he said. "She works in marketing." I said that was nice and asked if he wanted coffee. I didn't say what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that Owen had barely finished grieving his mother and had immediately found someone to fill the quiet. I'd seen it happen with other men his age. The loneliness comes in fast after a loss like that, and some people make decisions from loneliness that they'd never make otherwise. But I wasn't his mother. I didn't have Nora's way of saying the uncomfortable thing gently enough that you actually heard it, so I kept my mouth shut and paid attention. The first time I met Claudette in person was dinner at a place she'd chosen downtown, one of those restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices on the guest copy. She was charming, genuinely charming. Not in a performative way, but in the way where she asked questions and remembered the answers. She asked about my work, my history, how long I'd lived in San Francisco. She touched Owen's arm when she talked about him. Small gestures, the kind that look unplanned. I watched all of it. What I noticed, the thing that lodged somewhere in the back of my mind and stayed there, was a question she asked me about 40 minutes into dinner. "Owen says you've lived in the same house for over 30 years. That neighborhood must be worth a lot now." I said yes. Property values had changed considerably. She nodded and said, "You must feel good knowing Owen will be set." Owen laughed. He said, "Dad's not going anywhere." Meant it as a joke. She laughed too, but she'd asked the question, and I'd heard it, and I filed it away the way Nora had taught me to file away the things that needed thinking about. Over the next year and a half, I watched. I didn't interfere. I watched Claudette move from occasional dinners to weekends at Owen's apartment, to, eventually, a drawer at his place, then 2 drawers, Then a conversation Owen had with me over the phone where he told me she'd moved in and that he was thinking about asking her to marry him. I asked him what he loved about her. He gave me a list that sounded like a man reading from memory. Good answer, I thought, but prepared. I called our family lawyer the next morning. His name is Philip Sondergaard, and he'd been handling our family's legal affairs since before Owen was born. I explained the situation. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "You want to make sure the house and the assets are structured correctly before there's a marriage in the picture." That's exactly what I wanted. What most people don't understand about asset protection is that it works best when you do it early, before there's a reason anyone would challenge it. Nora had understood this. She'd already set up a revocable trust years before she died, and when she passed, the house and a significant portion of our investments moved into it in a way that made them mine for my lifetime and Owen's after me. But not marital property, not accessible to a spouse in a divorce, protected by structure rather than by argument. Philip helped me reinforce those structures. He updated the beneficiary designations. He made sure the deed was titled correctly. He reviewed what Nora had done and added a few layers she hadn't gotten to. When Owen called me 2 months later to say he'd proposed and Claudette had said yes, I told him congratulations and asked where they were thinking of having the wedding. He said Claudette had some ideas. I should tell you about the wedding. I'm going to tell you about the wedding because it's where things became impossible to ignore. The venue alone was $40,000. I know this because Owen told me, not because he was asking me to pay, but because he was clearly already overwhelmed and didn't know who else to say it to. It was a winery in Napa Valley that Claudette had found online. 65 guests on her side, 19 on ours. She had a large family, most of them flying in from out of state, and Owen was picking up a portion of the travel costs, because Claudette had made the argument that her family shouldn't have to bear the expense of the venue her future father-in-law could afford. I want to stop and note that I had not offered to pay for the wedding. The phrasing, her future father-in-law could afford, was doing a specific kind of work in that sentence, and I heard it clearly. I paid for my portion. I did not pay for her family's flights. Owen and I had a quiet conversation about that, and to his credit, he agreed with me once I said it plainly. The flowers were $14,000. Claudette's dress was $9,000. There was a post-wedding brunch at the hotel the next morning that cost more than my first car. I sat at the head table and watched my son write checks with money from his savings account, money he'd spent 8 years building. And I thought about Nora, about what she would have said, and I thought she probably would have said it the night before the wedding, in a quiet room, not at the table where everyone could hear. I didn't have her gift for timing, so I waited. They moved into Owen's apartment after the honeymoon, which was 2 weeks in the Maldives that I know for a fact cost $12,000. Because Owen mentioned it while we were watching a game one evening, the kind of mention that's not really casual, that's really a man trying to say something he doesn't know how to say directly. I said, "That's a lot of money." He said, "Yeah." Then we watched the rest of the game and didn't talk about it again. Claudette quit her marketing job 3 months after the wedding. She told Owen the commute was affecting her quality of life and that she'd been thinking about starting her own consulting business. That was 14 months ago. The consulting business never materialized as far as I could tell. What materialized instead was a lifestyle that required Owen's full salary plus a portion of his savings to maintain. A personal trainer 3 times a week. A stand-in appointment at a salon in the marina that ran about $300 a visit. Clothing I recognized as expensive without knowing the names of the designers. Dinners out, always at her choosing. Always at places with no prices on the guest copy of the menu. Owen worked in structural engineering. He was good at it, and he made a decent living, but he was not a wealthy man in the way Claudette seemed to have anticipated. I think she'd done some math in her head that involved me, the house, the neighborhood, the family wealth she'd alluded to at that first dinner, and the math had come out in her favor. I think she'd looked at my son and seen a vector towards something she wanted, and she'd been patient about it in the way that people who've done this before can be patient. I'm not saying I knew for certain. I'm saying I suspected, and suspicion is enough to make you careful. About 8 months into the marriage, Claudette asked Owen about my estate planning. Owen told me about this because he thought it was a normal question, the kind of practical thing spouses discuss. I asked him how the conversation had come up. He said they'd been talking about buying a larger apartment, and Claudette had mentioned that if anything ever happened to me, knowing the timeline on the house could help with their planning. I said, "Your mother and I handled the planning a long time ago. Everything is in order." He nodded. Then he said, "She wants to know more specifically. She says it helps to understand the full picture." I looked at my son for a moment. He looked back at me, and I could see something in his face. Not suspicion, exactly, but a kind of discomfort, like a man who's been asked to deliver a message he already knows isn't going to land well. I said, "The full picture is that I'll take care of it, and when the time comes, you'll know what you need to know." He said okay and changed the subject. That conversation was the first time I thought about the safe deposit box. I'd driven past First National 100 times since Nora died without stopping. I knew the key was in the lockbox in my study, still on its original keyring with the small paper tag in Nora's handwriting. I'd touched it exactly once, the week after the funeral, just to confirm it was there, and then put it back. 4 years. The box had been sitting in that bank with whatever Nora had put inside it, waiting. I wasn't ready to open it yet. I still didn't think it was the right moment, but I started thinking about it. The moment that changed things happened on a Wednesday evening in early spring. I'd driven up to Owen's apartment to drop off some of his mother's things. A box of photos and a few kitchen items I'd finally gotten around to sorting through. He'd given me a key the year before, and I let myself in because he told me he'd be home by 6. He wasn't home. Claudette was. She was in the kitchen on her laptop, and she closed it quickly when I walked in, not the way you close something you're embarrassed about, the sharp practice close of someone who had been waiting for an interruption. I said hello and set the box on the table. We made small talk. She offered me a glass of wine. I said no thank you, and sat down. Then she said, quite directly, "Owen mentioned you have a safe deposit box." I said that was right. She said he doesn't know what's in it. I said that was also right. There was a pause. She was studying me the way people study you when they're deciding how direct to be. Then she said, "I just think it's a little unfair, honestly. He's your son. He should know what's in his own family's finances." I said, "There's nothing about my finances in that box." She said, "Then what's the point of hiding it?" I said, "I'm not hiding anything. I'm keeping something private until the right time." She didn't push further. But the way she looked at me before she picked up her wine glass, that look, I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't backing down. It was the look of someone recalibrating, making a new plan. I drove home and called Philip Sondergaard the next morning. I want to be careful here, because I know how this part of the story can sound. I know it can sound like a father who never liked his daughter-in-law finding reasons to justify his feelings. I've asked myself that question honestly. I asked Nora's sister, who is one of the most fair-minded people I know, and I described the conversations without editorial, and asked her what she heard. She said, "That woman is building a case." I asked her what she meant. She said, "She's documenting what there is to find and figuring out what's still hidden." That's not curiosity. That's preparation. Philip Sondergaard said something similar, in more legal terms. I told him I wanted to make the existing structures airtight, whatever airtight looked like on paper. He spent 3 weeks on it. When he was done, the house was held in trust in a way that was completely outside the reach of any marital claim in any California court. The investment accounts were structured such that Owen was the beneficiary, but Claudette was not, and never could be without my explicit written change. I had a new will that was simple and specific, and left no room for interpretation. Philip said, "If she ever tries to argue any of this, she'll lose quickly and pay legal fees on top of it." That was enough. Or I thought it was enough. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how far she would actually go. I was in Portland visiting my college roommate Bernard when Owen called me. It was a Saturday morning, mid-April, rain coming sideways off the Columbia River, the kind of gray day that makes you feel like the world is slightly smaller than usual. I'd been up early drinking coffee at Bernard's kitchen table while his dog sat on my feet, and my phone rang at 7:43. Owen's voice was tight in the way it gets when he's frightened but trying to sound calm. He said, "Dad, Claudette's gone to the bank. I said, "What do you mean she's gone to the bank?" He said, "She took some papers from my desk. I don't know what papers. I was in the shower, and she called a car, and she left. She told me before she went that she was going to have access to the deposit box because she has legal standing as your daughter-in-law, and because there might be assets in there she's entitled to understand." I sat very still for a moment. Bernard's dog looked up at me. I said, "Owen, listen to me. She cannot open that box. She has no standing. She is not on the account. She is not listed anywhere in connection with that box, and the bank will not allow her access regardless of what paperwork she brings." There was a long pause. He said, "She seemed very sure." I said, "She can be as sure as she wants. The answer is still no." I called Philip from the car on the way to the airport, even though I already knew she wouldn't get in. He confirmed what I told Owen. Without my written authorization and her own identification on the account, no bank employee was going to open that box for her. He said he'd call the branch manager at First National as a precaution. I said thank you and booked the next flight to San Francisco. I landed at SFO at 2 in the afternoon. Philip had already spoken to the branch manager, a calm, methodical woman who had seen everything in 20 years of banking and was not remotely impressed by Claudette's argument that she had a right to the contents of her father-in-law's safe deposit box. Claudette had apparently arrived with printed pages. I still don't know where she'd gotten them, whether she'd found something in Owen's desk or simply printed information she'd researched online, and had presented them to a young teller as evidence of her entitlement. The teller had gotten the manager. The manager had said no. Claudette had asked for a supervisor. The manager had said she was the supervisor. Claudette had stood in the lobby for 11 minutes, according to the security log Philip later showed me, before finally leaving. I know she stood there for 11 minutes because I think about those 11 minutes sometimes. What was she calculating in those 11 minutes? Was she deciding whether to push harder? Was she already moving on to a different plan? I don't know, but 11 minutes is a long time to stand at a bank lobby after you've been told no. I drove to Owen's apartment from the airport. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived. Claudette wasn't there. He said she'd come home around noon and they'd had an argument, and she'd gone to a friend's house. He looked tired in a way that had been building for a while. Not just that day's tired, a longer tired. I sat down across from him and said, "I think it's time you knew what's in the box." He looked at me. I said, "Not because she went after it. Because you deserve to know. Your mother wanted you to know when the time was right, and I think I've been waiting too long." We drove to the bank together the next morning. Sunday, the branch was on limited hours, but Philip had arranged access. The manager let us into the vault herself. I signed the log. She brought the box to the private room and left us alone. Owen sat across the small table from me while I opened it. I'd never opened it before. Not once in 4 years. I want to be honest about what that was like, lifting the lid for the first time, not knowing exactly what Nora had put there, only what she told me. Everything he needs to know about who I was before I was his mother. Inside the box, there were 3 items. The first was a letter in Nora's handwriting. 12 pages, front and back, written on the cream stationery she'd bought at a shop in Hayes Valley 15 years ago. I recognized the handwriting immediately. She'd written more carefully than usual, the way she wrote when she was trying to be precise. I slid it across the table to Owen. The second was a small album, the kind with the magnetic pages, the type they don't make anymore. It had photographs in it that I'd never seen. Nora before I knew her, years before. A young woman in places I'd only heard about, standing in front of a bus in Austin, laughing with someone at a table in what looked like New Orleans. A solo shot at a beach I didn't recognize, squinting into the sun, grinning hair the way she wore it in her 20s. She looked free in a way I don't know I'd ever quite seen her look, even when she was happy, even when things were good. Not because she wasn't happy with me, but because some freedom belongs to the time before everything is decided. The third item was a sealed envelope with Owen's name on it, in Nora's handwriting, dated 3 days before she died. Owen picked it up. He sat with it in his hand for a long time before he opened it. I looked at the wall and gave him whatever privacy a man can have sitting 3 feet away in a small room. I heard the paper unfold. I heard him breathe. A few minutes passed. When I looked back at him, he was sitting with the letter flat on the table, staring at something I couldn't see. He said, "She knew." I said, "Knew what?" He said, "She says in here, she says, don't rush the grief. She says, take the time you need before you let anyone in. She says, the people who push to understand your family's business before they've earned your trust are telling you something about themselves." He looked up at me. He said, "She wrote that 4 years before I met Claudette." I said, "Your mother was often 4 years ahead of everyone." He laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind that lives right next to something painful, but it was real. We sat in that room for almost 2 hours. He read the long letter slowly, the way you read something you want to remember rather than just get through. He looked at the photographs for a long time. He asked me about a few of them. Who was the woman laughing with her in New Orleans? Where was the beach? I told him what I knew and admitted what I didn't. There were things about Nora I'd never known, and I found I didn't mind not knowing them. She'd been her own person before she was mine, and she was still her own person, even now. The box hadn't changed that. It had just made it visible. On the drive home, Owen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been making a lot of excuses for her." I said, "I know." He said, "I think I knew they were excuses." I didn't say anything. He said, "I kept thinking that if I just gave her more time, she'd be the person I thought she was when we first met." I said, "People usually are who they are from the beginning. We just decide how long to take convincing ourselves." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Mom would have told me this in October." I said, "October of which year?" He thought about it. He said, "October of the first year, when I first brought her home." I said, "Probably." He said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Probably." He said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because I'm not your mother. I was working with a different set of tools." He nodded slowly, and I think he understood what I meant. Not that I'd failed, but that I'd done what I could with what I had, and that Nora had, in her way, done the rest. The divorce proceedings began 6 weeks later. I'll spare you most of the details because the details aren't the point. What matters is what Claudette found and what she didn't find. Her lawyer filed a discovery request for financial records that took Philip about 40 minutes to respond to, because every document was exactly what it appeared to be, and every structure was exactly as I'd set it up. The house was in trust and outside marital property. The accounts were titled correctly. There was no hidden cash, no informal arrangement, no undisclosed asset that a clever lawyer could argue had been kept from her. There was nothing to find because there had never been anything to hide. Everything was simply protected, and protected legally and cleanly. She asked for half of Owen's projected inheritance. Philip responded with a letter explaining that no such inheritance was marital property under California law, and citing 3 cases that said so. Her lawyer stopped mentioning the inheritance after that. She asked for spousal support, arguing that she'd given up her career to support the marriage. The judge looked at 2 years of bank records and noted that the expenditures in the marriage had come primarily from one direction, and it wasn't hers. Spousal support was denied. She received a settlement from Owen that reflected what was legally hers, her share of the joint savings account, which at that point held less than $12,000 because the rest had been spent. She left the marriage with approximately what she'd entered it with. The morning the paperwork was finalized, Owen called me. He said, "It's done." I said, "How are you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I feel like I can breathe." I said that was a good sign. He said, I want to see the photos again. The ones of Mom, the ones from New Orleans. I said I had them at the house. The branch had released the box's contents to me after the divorce was underway, and Owen had taken copies of everything. I said, come over whenever you wanted. He came that Sunday. I made the lamb stew Nora used to make, the recipe I'd spent 3 years getting approximately right, and we sat at the kitchen table where she used to sit with the lawyer going through documents, and we ate and we talked. Not about Claudette. Not about the divorce. About Nora. About the woman in the photographs. The one standing in front of the bus in Austin. The one laughing in New Orleans. The one squinting at the sun on a beach. Neither of us could identify. Owen said, I wonder where that beach was. I said I'd asked her once, years ago, and she just smiled and said it was somewhere warm and left it at that. He smiled at that. The real kind. The unhurried kind. I thought about what Nora had told me in those last weeks, sitting by the window watching the oak tree. Don't open it yourself. Wait until Owen needs to see what's inside. I'd thought for 4 years that I was waiting for the right moment, that I'd know it when it came. And I had known it. It had come in the worst possible way, and I'd recognized it immediately, and I'd done what needed to be done. But sitting there with my son at the kitchen table, I understood something else. The box hadn't just been protection. Nora hadn't built it as a defensive measure. Though it had served as one, she'd built it as a conversation she couldn't have in person, a way of reaching across the years to say the things a mother wants to say to her son that are too important for a Tuesday afternoon. Don't rush the grief. Take your time before you let anyone in. The people who push to understand your family's business before they've earned your trust are telling you something about themselves. She'd known. Not about Claudette specifically. About the shape of what could happen, the way loss can make you vulnerable to exactly the wrong kind of attention. She'd seen it in her years of living, and she'd written it down and sealed it and trusted me to keep it safe until the moment arrived. I'd kept it safe. That felt like enough. That felt like more than enough. We stayed at the table long past dark. Owen and I, the photos spread out between us, the stew pot empty on the stove, the oak tree outside the window, catching the light from the kitchen the way it always did. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a house when the right people are in it and the wrong ones are gone, and you don't manufacture it, you can't plan for it, you just recognize it when it comes. That night, it came. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in some abstract way. Just the plain, ordinary version of it that you see when you look back at a sequence of events and trace the line from beginning to end. Claudette didn't lose because I outmaneuvered her. She lost because of the choices she made from the very beginning, and those choices had a logic to them that eventually ran out of road. When you build a relationship on what you can extract from it, rather than what you can put into it, you're not building anything. You're borrowing against time, and the debt comes due. It always comes due. I didn't need to do anything dramatic to bring that about. I just needed to make sure the structures were in place so that when it came due cleanly. What I keep coming back to, the thing that sits with me most, is Owen. Not Claudette, not the bank visit, not the legal paperwork. Owen, because he's a smart man, genuinely smart, the kind of smart that comes from paying attention rather than from credentials, and he still spent 2 years making excuses for someone who didn't deserve them. I understand it now in a way I didn't fully understand when it was happening. Grief does something specific to your judgment. It creates a space where you need someone to step into, and if the wrong person steps in at the right moment, the longing can look exactly like love for longer than it should. That's not weakness. That's being human, but it means the people around you have to hold steady while you find your way back to yourself. And that's what I was trying to do. Hold steady. Not intervene, not control. Just stay in place so there was something solid to come back to. Nora understood this better than I did. She understood it so well that she put it in a letter and locked it in a box and trusted it to survive 4 years until her son was ready to hear it. Don't rush the grief. Take your time before you let anyone in. That's not a religious principle, and it's not philosophy. It's just the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who'd watched people she loved make costly mistakes from loneliness and never wanted her son to make the same ones. She had the moral clarity to say it plainly, and the intelligence to deliver it at the right moment rather than the convenient one. And she had the discipline, the quiet, steady discipline, to build something that would still be standing years after she was gone. I think about that a lot now, the discipline of it. The patience of it. She didn't know who Owen would marry. She didn't know there would be a Claudette. She just knew the shape of the risk, and she prepared for it anyway, because that's what you do when you love someone and you're paying attention. I'm 63 years old, and I've made plenty of mistakes. But I did one thing right in all of this, and it was simple. I kept the box safe. I didn't open it too early out of curiosity. I didn't tell Owen about it when I thought it might comfort him in the first hard months after his mother died. I waited, the way she asked me to wait, trusting that she had understood something I didn't yet see. She had. She always had. If there's anything worth taking from this, it's that. Wisdom isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in a locked box for 4 years, waiting for the moment when it will mean the most. And integrity. The real kind, not the performed kind, is just the willingness to keep it safe until that moment comes, even when no one is watching, even when it would be easier not to. Owen has that in him. I saw it the night we sat at the kitchen table with his mother's photographs spread between us. He was sad, and he was clear-eyed at the same time. And that combination, I've learned, is what a person looks like when they're finally telling themselves the truth. That takes a particular kind of courage. The quiet kind. The kind his mother would have recognized immediately. She would have been proud of him. I know I am.